Just don't push it. Don't push it. Okay. I met Tom the first time about the time that we merged our clubs. We were cleaning off tables in the residence hall. That's why I got to know him and found out he was an FBI agent. And some of you know that I was a federal officer myself, both in the United States Army and a commissioned officer of the Food and Drug Administration to make sure that nobody misused the drugs in animal feeds. So, but I immediately thought, oh, we're going to have to hear from him. I've known several people over the years who are FBI agents. We have a mutual acquaintance, and Walt Valentine, and there's probably several people in this room remember Walt. Walt was here, a special agent for a lot of years. But Tom Williams came to us by way of the other Kiwanis club. He's always been a Kiwanian. He was born in Abingdon.
Actually, I was born in the state of Washington, but I'm from Abingdon, Virginia.
Okay. Coast to coast in one fell swoop. There we go. He now resides in West Lafayette with his wife Ann, 2 children. His FBI career is extensive. 1976 to 81, he was a headquarters support employee. What was that? Emptying the trash?
Basically.
Support at FBI headquarters, and then from 81 to 83, he was special agent. SA, what's SA? Special agent? Okay. New Haven, Connecticut. That's pretty good duty. I would think that'd be all right. 1983, he paid his dues. Special agent in New York City. Yes, I'm looking at you.
It's about when Lenny left, wasn't it?
1981 to 91, he came back to FBI headquarters in Washington. And 91 to 2005, Dallas, Texas. And he did not melt. He's still here. From 2005 to 2009, he's been in the Lafayette area as part of the Indianapolis office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He indicates to me that he will not need to plead the fifth today, that he can tell you what he wants to tell you about his time in the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Tom Williams, one of our own.
This thing on, I assume? Yes. Okay, I'm not used to holding a mic, and so you'll forgive me. I haven't looked forward to today for a couple of reasons. Number one, I have to follow Lenny and Jairus, and they're tough acts to follow. They really are. So forgive me if I don't quite measure up, but I'll give it a try. Number two, I'm always a little fearful in this day and age to when someone finds out about my former employment. I get strange questions, and that's not to say that I will get strange questions today. Well, if you have a strange question, I will answer it. But if it helps, I'll start my presentation out by telling you I do not know Mr. Strzok, Elisa Page. I don't know Andy McCabe, and I never danced on a disco floor while I was armed. So, I'm clueless. That was a different. I guess I was in a different FBI. But what I prepared for you today is just a brief PowerPoint. I'm not going to beat you to death with this PowerPoint, but it's kind of the evolution of the FBI, or at least the evolution as I see it. You could give this same lecture to 100 other FBI agents, and they would probably do 100 different things. But this is mine, and so I hope that it answers at least some of your questions beforehand, or at least gives you an overview of how the FBI has evolved over the years. It was created in July, which handled all matters related to the Department of Justice, except those made by bank examiners and the Naturalization Service. Just as a prelude, most of you probably don't know it or not, but FBI agents are not peace officers. Now, what do I mean when I say that is your local police officers wear uniforms, they ride around in marked cars, and they ride from call for service to call for service. And oftentimes they will be required to sort out like a domestic dispute or an armed robbery or whatever, and they are authorized by the state to make an arrest on the spot if they believe that they have probable cause. FBI agents cannot do that because we are not peace officers. Everything that we do in regard to arrest, subpoenas, summonses, anything like that, has to be worked in conjunction with the Department of Justice and the U.S. Attorney's Office. If I'm in the bank and if I'm standing in line and there's a bank robbery, I have no more authority to act than anyone else standing in line. But assuming I have a gun on my hip, I probably have some obligations to act usually after the robbers have left. It's probably not a good idea to try to intervene in an armed bank robbery in progress. FBI agents were not authorized to carry firearms until the 1930s. And so basically what the old Bureau of Investigation, and this is what the FBI was called back then, they're basically like what I would think of as an inspector general. They didn't have arrest powers. If they built a case against someone, they submitted a set of facts, which became an affidavit, and the U.S. Attorney's Office would review it, and if they agreed, they would file it with the court, and they'd get an arrest warrant, or they'd do an indictment, and if there's an arrest warrant issued, it would have to go to the U.S. Marshal Service for service, and we wouldn't be involved in an arrest, or really anything more than an indictment. What happened was also the old Bureau of Investigation had no security jurisdiction. And what happened after World War I, there was a wave of bombings that we generally refer to in American history today as the Red Scare. Now, the individual that is portrayed there is the Attorney General during that time. He actually had his residence bombed by anarchists, and his name was A. Mitchell Palmer, and he took umbrage, obviously, to his house being bombed, and he led the DOJ on kind of a wave of deportations and arrest of foreign-born anarchists and communists and that kind of thing. And a lot of what happened during that 1919 and 1920 was led by a very young departmental attorney who had made his name previously out of law school by developing the indexing system used by the Library of Congress. And his name was John Edgar Hoover. So right here we see a very young man hired by the DOJ in 1917 and was appointed an assistant director of the Bureau of Investigation in 1921. In 1924, he became director, and this was a little bit after the Teapot Dome scandal. I don't mean to do a history lecture here today, but the Attorney General at the time was a man by the name of Harlan Stone. He believed that, and with some very good justification, that the Teapot Dome scandal case was mishandled, and it was mishandled by the Bureau of Investigation. The reason is because a large number of the investigators were appointed by friends of congressmen and other government officials. There was no vetting system for them. There was no test that they took. They were basically cronies of some of the people that were actually involved in the Teapot Dome scandal. And so after the this thing cooled off for a while, Calvin Coolidge asked Harlan Stone to find someone to clean the Bureau of Investigation out and to put it on the straight and narrow. And this is who he chose, J. Edgar Hoover. A lot of people don't remember, or they don't understand, that when he was initially appointed as director of the Bureau of Investigation, J. Edgar Hoover was considered to be a reformer, and he was. And what he did was he cleaned house. There were about 600 special agents when he started his purge, and within 5 years, that number was down to about 300. So he's basically cleaning house, and he was involved in a lot of this firsthand. He took a hands-on approach to this. He knew most of the agents in most of the field offices. If he called a field office and he talked to the head of the office, which we would call an SAC, which stands for Special Agent in Charge, he would often ask, how's Charlie doing? Is he hitting his deadlines for his reports? How about Frank? Have you got him to wear a tie in the office yet? So he was personally involved in the development of the organization. And one of the things that he wanted to do, and he did do, is he wanted to professionalize the job. And he wanted to be kind of the ideal law enforcement and security service, not just in the United States, but in the world. I've included this picture because, for a couple of reasons. Number one, Charles Appel was the first head of the FBI's laboratory division. This was established during the late 1920s. And Charles actually was a one-man lab for several years before they could get funding up to purchase a lab and hire people that had laboratory experience. So he kind of did it all. He did the typewriter exam on the Lindbergh case, pretty much by himself. His son was also an agent that I actually worked with. That's not unusual within the FBI. What I found in my own career is that large numbers of the agents had fathers who were also FBI agents when they were younger, and some of them even had grandfathers that were FBI agents. So there's kind of a family legacy thing with a lot of agents. A lot of Irish Catholics, I found. I think probably for a couple of reasons. Number one is because the Irish had gravitated toward police work earlier in the century. And because many of them led that good Catholic life that J. Edgar was so fond of. Not that he wasn't Catholic, but he felt that Irish Catholics were made for strong agents because of their religious background as well as their their law enforcement heritage. This is the laboratory today. This actually used to be, the laboratory used to be in an FBI headquarters, and they moved it out 3 or 4 years ago, and they moved it to Quantico. They had outgrown the space that they were in at FBI headquarters in Washington. And so this is what it looks like. One of the things that the FBI really does well, and I don't think that a lot of people understand or even the organization gets credit for, but the support it provides other law enforcement agencies. Every police department in the country would be less effective and less efficient today if it weren't for the FBI. And the reason is because of so much technical support that we have provided for local and state police. The laboratory is just one of them. We also have things like the main computer system throughout the U.S. for criminal histories. It's called the NCIC. If you get stopped by the police as you leave here, and the policeman will probably run your plate and your name and date of birth through the NCIC computer to see whether you're wanted in any states or if you have a criminal record. Uniform crime reports. The NICS, if you purchase a firearm, or you desire to purchase a firearm, you go into a firearms dealer, and you have at least a 3-day waiting period, while your record is checked with the NICS system. So many things that we provide for state and local police. The FBI National Academy is for police officers, and all the police departments in the area, the ranking police officers have all been to the FBI Academy and are graduates of the National Academy. This is a picture that I couldn't resist. I wish many of you probably can't see it, but these are FBI agents in training about 1940. This was before Quantico, the training mission at Quantico was established. They did all the training in Washington, D.C. in the Department of Justice. This is up on the roof of the Department of Justice. And as you can see, this is probably spring, and the guys haven't had a chance to get a good tan yet. But this is probably a group of lawyers and accountants that are in training for FBI. And you can see that's the Capitol in the background. The director actually had the roof reinforced so that they could do PT up on the roof of the Department of Justice. The guy leading in calisthenics is a guy that was known as Gump. Gump was his last name, but everybody just called him Gump. And I didn't know Gump was before my time, but during the 1930s, he had made a name for himself in places like Chicago, making arrest of gangsters and that kind of thing. And he was very good at it, a very strong guy, and so the director made him head of basically what would be head of the physical training unit for the FBI. And he would take guys up on the roof of the Justice Department for calisthenics and to do defensive tactics. So that was Gump. This is the FBI Training Academy in Quantico, about 1980. This is I didn't fly over it, but this is the academy that I would know. I went through the academy in 1981. Also headquartered at Quantico is basically the FBI's SWAT team. There's a SWAT team there called the Critical Incident Response Group, and it's headquartered there. This is what we called the identification division. For years, and it's still done really the same way it was back then almost, as an individual who's arrested will have his fingerprints taken, and usually a PD will retain a set, and they will send another set to the FBI identification division, where it will be classified and filed, so that in the future, if say this individual is a suspect in a burglary, they have latent fingerprints that they can submit, it would go to the identification division, those latent prints would be classified, and these fingerprint examiners would actually go through drawers and drawers of fingerprint cards, trying to get a match. And to some extent, it's still handled the same way that it was in 1929, only machines do a lot of the initial processing, but when it gets down to a cabinet kind of thing level, you need a fingerprint examiner to actually examine it and to make an identification. This is the identification division, or what is now the Criminal Justice Information Services Division. Now it's in Clarksburg, West Virginia, and it handles all the fingerprint cards now that are sent into the FBI. It handles the Uniform Crime Reporting, the NICS and the NCIC, and a majority of the other law enforcement services that the FBI provides. Anyone know who that is? That is
John Dillinger.
that is Indiana's own John Dillinger. Thank you. I think he's from Martinsville.
A friend of yours, right? Friend of mine.
What I'm going to go through the next few slides are going to be kind of FBI priorities over the decades and how they might have changed. Beginning in the 30s, gangsters, law enforcement services, German and Soviet espionage, World War II Special Intelligence Service, property crimes and fugitives. Gangsters obviously were very big. We didn't really start carrying firearms until the 1930s. German and Soviet espionage. I've been kind of a student of some of the old cases that were worked back then, and they did some excellent work back then. To not have the resources that we have now, most German spy rings were rolled up pretty quickly about the time that hostilities started. Soviet espionage, of course, it has never ended. And a lot of people don't realize it, but in World War II, there was no Central Intelligence Agency. And President Roosevelt was deeply concerned about what was happening in Central and South America, because there were strong German influences in both of those places. And so he asked the FBI to develop an intelligence network which covered both Central and South America, with the goal of thwarting German intelligence efforts down there. And they were largely successful. And a lot of the guys that were involved in this effort later became the first agents of the Central Intelligence Agency. The 1950s to 1970s, priorities changed just a little bit. The director finally woke up to the fact that there were large organized crime elements in the U.S. At that time, they were mainly Italian-based. The guy in the picture is Joe Valachi. He was one of the first made members of the La Cosa Nostra, that was turned, and here he is testifying before Congress. What he's demonstrating is this ceremony of omertah, where a pledge or for a membership, to be a made man in the Cosa Nostra, would take a pledge while burning a wadded up piece of paper in his hands, and he would put it back and forth in his hands to try to keep from burning his hands. So that's what he's demonstrating there. Civil rights began to come on the front burner during that time mainly because of Klan activity in the South and the ongoing counterintelligence effort, again, mainly against Soviet espionage, but to include the Soviet bloc nations, or what was then the Soviet bloc nations of Eastern Europe. Law enforcement support, white-collar crime, fugitives, property crimes. That's FBI headquarters in 1974. That is about the time we started moving in from the Justice Department. I started working there myself in 1976, and they were, actually I think they were still moving the last components from the Department of Justice building all across the street to the J. Edgar Hoover building. And priorities changed just a bit with the times. Our highest priority at that time was white-collar crime, organized crime, counterintelligence. In 1982, kind of an interesting thing, we became co-parents of the drug problem with DEA. I can probably talk about that a little bit in the future. But property crimes, civil rights, counterterrorism, and law enforcement support. And here we are from the present. You'll probably recognize the then director, Robert Mueller, and the priorities that are pretty much the same are counterterrorism, counterintelligence, cyber crimes, public corruption, civil rights, organized crime, violent crime, and law enforcement support. And that's it. I am not sure how much time I have expended that I'm obligated to do, but
We can, you've got to consider military.
okay. All right. Well, if you do have questions that I can answer, go right ahead. Yes, Jim.
Tom, what is your training to become a FBI agent?
You mean what word?
What's your background?
Okay. All right. I'll start with the general requirements or baseline. The baseline requirements of being an FBI agent are 23 years of age, a bachelor's degree, and 3 years experience doing something else. The FBI does this kind of purposely. We look for candidates that are older, that have done something. We don't want people for the agent position. This is for the agent position. That are right out of college or even right out of law school. We want people that have had at least a start on a career doing something else and decide that they might want to give this a try. The areas that we primarily recruit from are law, accounting. I was an accountant. And I kind of learned this the hard way. If you remember from Jairus's explanation of my background, I began at FBI headquarters in 1976, not long after I got out of college. I had that dreaded double major of history and poli-sci. And after finding out exactly what that would get me, I went in the FBI as a support employee, and I kind of scoped out, what do these people want for the agent position? And so I went back to school at night and got an accounting degree. Now that's kind of the hard way, but it kind of worked for me. Because I'd always wanted to be an FBI agent, and I was willing to do, if they wanted an apple, I was more than willing to give them an apple. So I became an accountant, even though I hate accounting, to become an FBI agent. So today we recruit from, well, we still recruit from law and accounting. We recruit a lot of computer people, people with computer science backgrounds that maybe work for IBM or whoever for a few years. We Army officers, particularly those that have had some overseas deployments. Language personnel. One of my best friends in the FBI that I was his training agent, spoke fluent Mandarin Chinese, which is one of our key language needs, along with Russian and Arabic and Urdu and Dari and even Spanish. So those are the areas, prime areas that we recruit from.
Why don't you hire Buffington?
Well, I should. I was impressed with that Russian. Yes, sir.
Hey, when he graduated out of high school, I think in 1956, his English teacher asked him what he would like to do, and he said, he'd like to work for the FBI. He said, I'll help you write a letter to the FBI and see if you can get a job. So just right out of high school, he wrote the letter, and he got a job, and he worked in the fingerprint department for, I think, about 10 years, and then he moved back to Indiana. So that was his experience working for the FBI, not as an agent.
Yeah, the Identification Division hired a lot of young people out of high school. When I first went in, I thought about going to the Identification Division too, because it actually paid more than what I was doing. They actually pay those guys a little bit more, because it's extraordinarily tedious work. I mean, if you see these guys and they're stooped over these cabinets and they've got some magnifying glass out. They have to make some very precise calls on fingerprints. Yes.
Fingerprints, certainly there's computers that are doing that now, right?
There are computers that can do it to a certain point, but when you get to that point where you've got it fairly close to a match, you bring in a fingerprint examiner, because one of the reasons is because for testimony purposes, the use of the fingerprint examiners don't normally testify at trial. What they will do, what the fingerprint examiner will do, will make a match. They have agent examiners that supervise them. They will then be called in to verify that it's a match, and if that match is required testimony in court, the agent will be the one that will be subpoenaed in court to say that we have made a match on this latent fingerprint, which is identical to this fingerprint card, which was submitted by the West Lafayette Police Department. So that's kind of the way they do it. Yes, Lenny?
I always thought the CIA is more foreign oriented, and the domestic would be FBI. Would that be a simplified characterization? What's the coordination between the two agencies? Are they both reporting to Department of Justice? And especially when you have a case where you have foreign governments involved, and it's centered on something that's a domestic thing, let's say like election tampering or something like that, would the two agencies work together well, or how does that get coordinated?
Okay, that's That's an interesting question. What I will say about the Central Intelligence Agency is, yeah, their jurisdiction is overseas primarily, although they do have an internal component called the National Resources Division. And basically, that particular division is in contact with American companies and businesses that may do business overseas and run into people in interesting places that they'd like to talk about. So they do have a domestic, well, my point is they do have a domestic collection component. And they do work sometimes with the FBI, although they have a different mission than we do. The FBI's mission is counterintelligence within the United States, and we do have the lead on that. Even over the CIA. Overseas, it's their bailiwick with the State Department. The FBI works much better with the CIA than it used to.
It was a major problem.
It was a problem. It wasn't always the FBI's fault. In some cases it was. The CIA didn't really want to work with us because of the different cultures that we had, different corporate cultures, everything was different. I was, as a headquarters supervisor, I was a desk officer for an Eastern European nation which used to spy on the United States. That doesn't happen anymore, not with that particular nation, because when the wall fell, that nation became our friends as opposed to the Russians. But they weren't particularly cooperative or interested in what we had. They considered us to be intelligence amateurs, and in some cases they were right. And they weren't that interested in working with us that much, although they would when it was to their advantage. Today, coordination is much better. When I was in Dallas, we built a new field office that we moved into, and the CIA local field office for that component that I spoke of earlier actually was co-located with us, and they would often work with us hand in hand when our interests coincided. In most cases, though, our interests didn't coincide because they were interested in different things than we were. I don't know if I answered your question or not, but
Maybe just one more.
go ahead.
Well, I get these messages, wait a minute now, I'm gonna fix it. I get these messages often on my computer about the dangers of hacking into my account. And the stories in the paper indicate that this is a very, very serious problem. Eastern European and Russian hackers, even in folks like me.
And me.
I should be, I don't know what they can do for me. Is that a real problem?
Yes, it is a real problem, and I get, the question is, in regard to cybercrime, a lot of the cybercrime today is committed by Eastern European organized crime gangs, Russian organized crime gangs from Nigeria, wherever. And is that a problem to thwart and to address? The answer is yes, it is, because generally speaking, the local police forces are not capable in Eastern Europe of handling serious cyber crimes. In some cases, their police are corrupt. In Russia, sometimes they're even sponsored by the Russian government. And so you're not going to get a whole lot of cooperation. And it's not like, we can get a warrant and we can parachute some marshals in to make an arrest and bring these people out. So it's a very difficult problem to address. And I wish I could give more detail on what we could do. Well, one of the things I will say is that if you do have cybersecurity questions, like if you get emails from someone that you believe is a scam, the FBI does have a program that you can report this to. It's called the letter I, the letter C is in Charlie, the number 3.gov. You can go on this website and you can file a complaint yourself. And actually, the FBI refers all cyber complaints to that computer because it is able to process them much more quickly than say, an agent taking a complaint over the phone or in person. And the computer can actually link the two similar complaints that might come from the same perpetrators. So that's something that you might want to keep in mind. That's ic3.gov. Have I expended my time? Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you.